My name is Rachel Donovan, I'm 48 years old, and my doctor literally saved my life by breaking every rule in the book. That September afternoon, I walked into Dr. Marcus's office expecting routine blood work results. What I got instead was a folded piece of paper slipped into my hand with 5 words that made my blood run cold. "Don't go home tonight." I should have listened, but I didn't. And what I discovered hiding in my own closet that evening was my husband of 20 years calmly planning my murder with his mistress, discussing the exact poison that would stop my heart in 3 days, and laughing about how no one would suspect a thing. For 2 decades, I thought I had the perfect marriage. David was a successful cardiovascular surgeon. I was a marketing executive. We lived in a beautiful $780,000 home in Portland, vacationed in Bali, had the life everyone envied. I trusted him completely. I had no idea he'd already done this before. I had no idea his first wife didn't actually die in a car accident, and I definitely had no idea that I was 48 hours away from becoming his second victim. This is the story of how a mysterious warning from my doctor, a closet with slatted doors, and my own refusal to run away exposed a conspiracy that would reveal my husband as something far worse than a cheating spouse. This is about how I recorded my own death sentence, brought down a killer who'd hidden behind a white coat for years, and got justice not just for myself, but for the woman whose murder had been buried as suicide 8 years ago. It's a long story, and honestly, I still can't believe I lived to tell it. If you want to hear how a single piece of paper unraveled everything and how I turned the tables on a man who thought he'd planned the perfect crime, is cheeky with me, you can follow along so you don't miss what happens next, because trust me, this is just the beginning. It all started on a Tuesday morning when I noticed my husband smiling at his phone in a way he hadn't smiled at me in months. That Tuesday morning, David was different. I remember standing in our kitchen, pouring coffee into my favorite ceramic mug, the one with tiny painted roses that my sister bought me for my birthday 3 years ago. David was at the table, supposedly reading medical journals on his tablet, but his face told a different story. He was smiling. Not the polite, distracted smile he usually gave me before heading to the hospital. This was genuine, warm, the kind of smile that used to be mine. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and that smile grew wider. "Good news?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He looked up, and for just a split second, I saw something flash across his face. Guilt? Panic? Then it was gone, replaced by his practiced, charming expression, "Just a colleague. We successfully closed a complicated valve replacement yesterday. Patient's doing great." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way he angled his phone away from me when he typed his response. Maybe it was how quickly he stood up, suddenly in a rush to leave 30 minutes earlier than usual. "I need to check on that patient before rounds," he said, kissing my forehead in that absent way that had become our normal. "Don't wait up tonight. I've got 2 surgeries scheduled." The front door closed. I stood there with my coffee, staring at nothing. We'd been married for 20 years, 20 years of building a life together, of supporting his grueling residency and fellowship, of moving across the country for his career, of postponing having children because the timing was never right. 20 years. And somewhere along the way, we'd become polite strangers who shared a mortgage, but this felt like more than emotional distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The first real crack appeared 3 days later, on Friday evening. I came home early from work. My team had finished a major campaign presentation, and my boss sent us home at 3. David's car was in the driveway. That was unusual. He never got home before 8 on Fridays. I walked in through the garage, calling out his name. No answer. I found him in his study, door closed, voice low. He was on the phone. I stood in the hallway, not quite eavesdropping, but not walking away either. ... "Can't do this now," he was saying, his tone urgent. "I told you, we have to be patient, just a little longer." Silence while the other person spoke. I know. I want that too. But we can't rush this. It has to look natural, or everything falls apart." My stomach twisted. "Listen, I have to go. I'll see you tomorrow at the usual place." "Yes, I promise." I heard him moving, so I quickly walked toward the kitchen, grabbing a glass and filling it with water, trying to look like I'd just arrived. He emerged from his study, startled to see me. "Rachel? I didn't hear you come in. Got home early." "Surprise." I forced a smile. "Everything okay? I heard you on the phone." Another flash of that expression I couldn't quite read. "Just scheduling issues at the hospital. You know how it is, everyone wants different shifts covered." But the hospital didn't schedule shifts on personal cell phones. They used the internal system. That night, lying in bed next to him, I stared at the ceiling while he slept peacefully beside me. The man I'd spent 2 decades with suddenly felt like a stranger. Every logical part of my brain said I was overreacting, reading too much into innocent moments. But a deeper instinct, a kind that lives in your gut, was screaming that something was very, very wrong. The second crack came the following week. I'd made a dentist appointment for Tuesday afternoon and took a half day off work. The appointment finished early, and I decided to surprise David by bringing him lunch at the hospital. He always complained about the cafeteria food, and there was a Thai place he loved near his office. I walked through the hospital's main entrance, carrying takeout containers, feeling almost silly for my recent paranoia. This was probably exactly what we needed, a spontaneous gesture, a reminder of better times. The volunteer at the information desk smiled at me. "Dr. Donovan, I think he's in the physician's lounge on the 3rd floor, or you could try his office in the cardiology wing." I headed to his office first. The door was closed. I raised my hand to knock, then heard voices inside. David's voice. And a woman's laugh. I pressed my ear closer to the door. "You're terrible," the woman said, her voice playful, intimate. "What if someone sees? Then they'll think we're discussing a case," David replied, "which is exactly what we're doing. Dr. Reyes, very professional. Dr. Reyes, Nina Reyes, I knew that name. She was a new attending in cardiology, hired about 18 months ago. David had mentioned her a few times, brilliant surgeon, incredible credentials. Is that what we're calling it now?" Nina's voice dropped lower. "Professional." I couldn't breathe. There was a long silence. Then rustling sounds. Then David's voice, thick with something I hadn't heard in years. "We should stop." "Not here." "You always say that," Nina murmured, "but you never mean it." I backed away from the door, the takeout containers shaking in my hands. I walked quickly back down the hallway, down the elevator, through the lobby, all the way to my car. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at nothing, my mind racing through every moment of the past year, recontexting everything. The late nights, the sudden interest in his appearance, new cologne, expensive haircuts, hours at the gym, the way he'd grown distant, distracted, the business trips that seemed to multiply. It wasn't the hospital making him happy that Tuesday morning. It was her. I drove home in a fog. I didn't cry. I felt numb, disconnected, like I was watching my life from outside my own body. That evening, when David came home, at his usual time, I watched him carefully. He kissed my forehead, asked about my day, microwaved leftovers. He was the same David. He'd always been pleasant, polite, detached. But I wasn't the same Rachel anymore. "How was work?" I asked. "Busy. 3 procedures back to back. I'm exhausted." He sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "Oh, and that new attending, Dr. Reyes, she's presenting a case study at the conference next month. Brilliant work." He said her name so casually, so easily. That's when I knew for certain. He was lying, and he was good at it. What I didn't know yet was that the affair was the least of my problems. The real danger was something I wouldn't discover until I ignored my doctor's warning 2 weeks later and hid in my own closet, watching my husband plan something that would make infidelity look like mercy. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I became someone I didn't recognize, a woman who checked her husband's phone while he showered, who memorized his passwords by watching his fingers on the keyboard, who suddenly developed reasons to drive past the hospital at odd hours. The paranoia consumed me, but I needed proof. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. What I found was worse than I imagined. It started with his credit card statements. David had always handled our finances. I made more money. He had the better head for numbers, or so I'd believed. I'd trusted him completely, never questioning where our money went. But now, sitting at my laptop at 2 in the morning while he slept upstairs, I logged into accounts I hadn't checked in years. My hands started shaking when I saw the charges. Hotels in Portland. Expensive ones, 5-star restaurants I'd never been to. Jewelry purchases from Tiffany's. I'd never received jewelry from him, not in the past 3 years at least. Hundreds of dollars at lingerie boutiques. Spa packages for 2. Wine, country, weekend getaways. I scrolled back through 18 months of statements. The pattern was clear and devastating. Every business trip he'd claimed, every late night at the hospital, every conference that supposedly required his attention, all carefully constructed excuses to be with her. The financial damage was staggering. He'd spent over $89,000 on his affair. $89,000 of our money. Money I'd helped earn. Money I thought was being saved for our future. But that wasn't even the worst part. I dug deeper into our financial accounts, and that's when the real horror revealed itself. Our joint savings account, that should have had $340,000 money we'd been building for nearly 2 decades now, had $127,000. Over $200,000 was missing. My heart pounded as I traced the withdrawals. Large cash advances, wire transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. David had been systematically draining our savings, and I'd been completely oblivious. Where was the money going? I needed to know more. The next morning, I called in sick to work something I rarely did. Instead, I drove to our bank and requested a meeting with our account manager, a pleasant woman named Susan, who'd helped us for years. I told her I was reviewing our finances for tax purposes and needed detailed records of all transactions for the past 2 years. Susan seemed happy to help, probably assuming this was some routine task David had asked me to handle. When she handed me the printed statements, her smile was genuine and unsuspecting. She had no idea she'd just given me the roadmap to my husband's betrayal. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, reading through page after page of transactions. The cash advances were enormous: $15,000 here, $20,000 there, always from different ATMs, always timed 2 days when David claimed to be in surgery or at conferences. Then I found the wire transfers. 3 of them, each for $50,000, sent to an account registered to something called Clearwater Holdings LLC. What the hell was Clearwater Holdings? I went home and spent the next 6 hours researching. Clearwater Holdings was a shell company registered in Delaware. Common tactic for hiding assets or moving money without clear paper trails. The registered agent was a law firm that specialized in asset protection and estate planning. Why would my husband be sending $150,000 to a shell company? My mind spun through possibilities. Was he planning to leave me? Was he hiding money from me in preparation for a divorce? Was this some kind of tax evasion scheme? Then I remembered something Nina had said through the office door that day. What if someone sees? And David's response, then they'll think we're discussing a case. They were hiding, planning. And based on the shell company and the drained accounts, they'd been planning for a long time. I needed more information, but I couldn't let David know I was investigating. I had to be smart, careful, strategic. That evening, David came home at his usual time. I'd made dinner salmon with roasted vegetables, one of his favorites. I poured him wine and asked about his day, playing the role of the dutiful, unsuspecting wife. He talked about a complicated surgery, about hospital politics, about the upcoming medical conference. He was so convincing, so natural. 20 years of marriage had taught him exactly how to lie to me. After dinner, while he watched television in the living room, I excused myself to take a bath. Instead, I locked myself in our home office and opened his laptop. He'd left it on, probably thinking I'd never dare to look. I found his email. The messages between David and Nina went back exactly 18 months, just as I'd suspected. At first, they were professional case discussions, surgical consultations. Then they shifted. Compliments became flirtations. Flirtations became explicit. By month 3, they were planning their first hotel room encounter, but it was the recent emails that made my blood turn to ice. One from 3 weeks ago, Nina to David G. I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of sharing you. When are we going to be together for real? David's response, soon. I promise. I'm working on a solution, just trust me. Nina, again. You've been saying that for months. I need more than promises. I need a timeline. David, by the end of the year, I'll be free, and we'll have everything we need to start over. Everything. Free. He wanted to be free of me. And then I found an email from 2 weeks ago that confirmed my worst fears. It was from David to someone named Marcus Chun, and the subject line was simple: consultation. The message was brief and cryptic. We need to discuss the matter we spoke about. Can we meet this week? This needs to be handled delicately and without any complications. Price is not an issue. Marcus Chun, doutor. Marcus Chun? My doctor. Why was my husband having secret consultations with my physician? I felt dizzy, nauseous. Something was catastrophically wrong here, something beyond infidelity and financial betrayal. This felt darker. Maurice. I printed the most damning emails, folded them carefully, and hid them in my car's glove compartment. Then I cleared the browser history and closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it. When I emerged from the office, David looked up from his phone and smiled at me. That same warm, genuine smile I'd noticed 2 weeks ago. The smile that had started all of this. I smiled back, fighting the urge to scream. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay next to him, listening to his steady breathing, wondering what he was planning. The shell company, the drained accounts, the cryptic email to my doctor, Nina's demands for a timeline. By the end of the year, he'd said, he'd be free. Free meant divorced, or it meant something worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger, real danger, and I had no idea how deep this conspiracy went. The answer would come 1 week later, on a Tuesday afternoon, when Dr. Marcus would hand me a folded piece of paper with a warning that should have sent me running as far away from my house as possible. Instead, it would send me straight into the closet where I'd hear my husband describe exactly how he planned to kill me. The appointment with Dr. Marcus was supposed to be routine. I'd been going to him for 12 years, annual physicals, the occasional flu, minor health concerns that come with getting older. He was professional, thorough, and kind. I trusted him completely, which made what happened that Tuesday afternoon so terrifying. I sat in the examination room, waiting for him to review my blood work results. Standard stuff: cholesterol, thyroid function, vitamin levels. I'd been feeling more tired than usual lately, but I'd attributed it to stress. After discovering David's affair and the missing money, I hadn't been sleeping well. Dr. Marcus walked in carrying my file, and immediately I noticed something was off. His hands were shaking slightly. His face looked pale, drawn. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. He went through the results mechanically. Everything looked fine, he said. My cholesterol was good. Thyroid normal. However, I was slightly anemic low, iron levels, which would explain the fatigue. Then he did something strange. He pulled out his prescription pad and started writing, but as he wrote, he slipped a small, folded piece of paper beneath the prescription and slid both across the desk to me. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to me, and he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. His voice was steady and professional as he explained that I should start taking iron supplements, that I'd feel better in a few weeks, that I should schedule a follow-up in 3 months. But his eyes were screaming something entirely different. I picked up the prescription and the paper, feeling the weight of whatever message he'd hidden there. I wanted to ask what was happening, wanted to demand an explanation, but something in his expression told me to stay silent. As I stood to leave, Dr. Marcus walked me to the door. His assistant was at her desk just outside, typing on her computer. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. An unusually personal gesture. Anne spoke quietly. Just trust him, he'd said. That was all. I made it to my car before opening the folded paper. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely unfold it. 5 words in hurried handwriting. Don't go home tonight. I sat there in the parking lot, staring at those words, my mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. Why would my doctor tell me not to go home? What did he know? How did he know it? And then the most terrifying question. What was waiting for me at home? Every rational part of my brain said I should listen to him. Drive to a hotel, call my sister. Stay away. But the part of me that had been investigating David for 2 weeks, the part that had found the drained accounts and the shell company and the cryptic emails, that part needed answers. If there was danger in my own home, I needed to know what it was. I needed to see it for myself, so I drove toward the one place I'd been told to avoid. I parked 3 blocks away, my heart hammering in my chest. It was 4 in the afternoon. David never came home before 8 on Tuesdays. He had a full surgical schedule on Tuesdays, or at least that's what he had told me. I approached the house from the back, using the alley behind our property. I let myself in through the laundry room door, moving as quietly as possible. The house felt different somehow, charged with a tension I could feel in my bones. Then I heard voices coming from the living room. David's voice, and a woman's voice. He was home, in the middle of the afternoon, with her. I moved silently down the hallway, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The hallway closet, the one we used for storing coats and rarely opened, had slatted doors that allowed you to see out without being seen. I slipped inside, leaving the door almost closed, and positioned myself where I could see into the living room. What I saw made my legs nearly give out beneath me. David sat on our couch next to Nina Reyes. That wasn't the shocking part. I'd known about the affair. What made my blood turn to ice was what covered our coffee table. Insurance documents, spreadsheets, real estate papers, and a small medical vial with a label that had my name on it. My name on a vial in my own living room. Nina leaned forward, picking up one of the documents. She said something about everything being ready for tonight, her voice clinical and cold, like she was discussing a surgical procedure rather than what. David picked up the vial, holding it up to the light. He confirmed that Dr. Marcus would prescribe my vitamin supplements that afternoon, that I would take them thinking they were for my anemia. He explained that within 3 days I would have what would appear to be a fatal heart attack. No one would suspect anything, he said. I had family history. It would look completely natural. I pressed my hand against my mouth, fighting the urge to vomit, to scream, to run. My husband was planning to kill me. The man I'd shared a bed with for 20 years. The man I'd supported through medical school and residency. The man I'd trusted with everything. He was calmly describing how he would murder me with something disguised as vitamins. Nina asked about the insurance policy. David smiled and mentioned the $3 million payout. Combined with the house and my our savings, they would finally be together without hiding. 18 months of waiting would be worth it, he told her. Then she said something that made everything worse. She mentioned his first wife, said it was too bad Jennifer hadn't had family to ask questions. First wife? David laughed. A surely laughed hand explained that Jennifer had been easier. She was young, with no resources, no support system. Nobody questioned her suicide, but I had my sister, who was an attorney, so they needed to be more careful this time. Suicide. He'd told me Jennifer died in a car accident. He'd killed her too. My husband hadn't just planned to murder me for insurance money. He'd done this before, 8 years ago, to his first wife. I was standing in my closet, watching a serial killer describe his methods. My phone was in my pocket. With shaking hands, trying not to make any sound, I pulled it out and opened the voice recording app. I hit record and held the phone toward the slatted door, capturing every single word. David talked about the digitalis mixed with potassium in the vial, how it would mimic a heart attack perfectly. Nina discussed a timeline, how they would wait an appropriate mourning period before going public with their relationship. David mentioned paying off his gambling debts I'd never known about with my life insurance money. They talked about Dr. Marcus, about how he was being blackmailed into helping them. David had discovered that Marcus had made a serious medical error years ago, one that could cost him his license and potentially lead to criminal charges. Marcus had no choice but to cooperate, David explained. The prescription he'd given me that afternoon was his way of participating in my murder. Except Dr. Marcus had also slipped me that warning. He'd found a way to save me while still protecting himself. They sat on my couch for nearly 40 minutes, discussing every detail of their plan. When the life insurance would pay out, how they'd sell the house, where they'd move together. Nina even joked about which of my jewelry she wanted to keep. Finally, David checked his watch. He told Nina he needed to get back to the hospital, that they both needed to return to their shifts. They couldn't be seen leaving together. He would go first. She would follow in 20 minutes. They stewed. David pulled Nina close and kissed her along, intimate kiss in my living room, in the house I'd helped pay for. Then he said something that made my blood run even colder. He reminded her to stay calm when she got my frantic phone call tonight. I would call her, panicked about sudden chest pain. She would tell me it was probably anxiety, nothing serious, but that I should come to the emergency room just to be safe. She'd be there, waiting, ready to declare my death when the poison did its work. They had thought of everything. David left through the front door. I heard his car start, heard him drive away. Nina stayed behind, gathering the papers from the coffee table and tucking them into her bag. She walked through my house with the confidence of someone who already owned it. 20 minutes later, she left too. I waited another 10 minutes, my entire body shaking, before I emerged from the closet. I stood in my living room, the recording still running on my phone, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. My husband wanted me dead. My doctor had tried to warn me, and I'd just recorded my own death sentence. But I'd also recorded their confession, every word, every detail, every piece of their conspiracy. They thought they'd planned the perfect crime. They thought I was the naive, trusting wife who would take her vitamins without question and die quietly within 3 days. They had no idea what I'd just heard. And they definitely had no idea what I was about to do with that recording. I sat in my car 3 blocks from my house, the recording playing back through my earbuds for the 4th time. David's voice, so calm and matter-of-fact, describing how the poison would stop my heart. Nina laughing about which of my jewelry she wanted. The casual mention of Jennifer's murder, dismissed like it was nothing more than an inconvenient detail from the past. Every time I listened, new details emerged. New horrors. But with each replay, something else grew inside me, something stronger than fear, rage, pure, crystallized rage. This man had taken 20 years of my life. He'd made me believe we were building something together while secretly planning to take everything from me, my money, my home, my future, my life itself. And Jennifer? Poor Jennifer, whose death had been buried as suicide, whose family had probably spent 8 years tormented by questions that would never be answered. Not anymore. I wasn't going to die. And I wasn't going to let him get away with what he'd done. But I needed help. Real help. This wasn't something I could handle alone. My first instinct was to call my sister Lauren. She was a criminal defense attorney in Seattle, sharp and resourceful. Exactly the kind of person who would know what to do. But something stopped me from dialing her number. David knew about Lauren. He'd mentioned her in that conversation, the already irritating attorney sister who would ask too many questions. If I involved her too early, if David suspected I knew anything, he might panic. He might accelerate his timeline or disappear entirely. I needed someone he didn't know about, someone with real authority. I needed law enforcement, not local police. This conspiracy involved a prominent surgeon, a hospital physician, and potentially other medical professionals. I needed someone who could handle something this complex, who had resources beyond what a local precinct could offer. I needed the FBI. I spent 20 minutes in that car, composing myself, making sure I looked calm and rational rather than like a terrified woman who'd just discovered her husband's murder plot. Then I drove to the Federal Building in downtown Portland. The FBI field office was housed on the upper floors of a modern glass building. Security was tight metal detectors, X-ray machines, guards who looked like they'd seen everything. I approached the reception desk, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. I told the receptionist I needed to speak with someone about a serious crime. She asked, what kind of crime? I took a breath and said the words that still didn't feel real, attempted murder and conspiracy. She picked up her phone. 15 minutes later, I was sitting in a small, sterile conference room across from a woman who introduced herself as Special Agent Sarah Chun. She was probably in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she didn't waste time on nonsense. I told her I had evidence of a conspiracy to commit murder, that my life was in immediate danger, and that a previous murder had been covered up as suicide. She listened without interrupting, her face giving nothing away. Then I played her the recording. I watched her expression change as she listened. The professional mask slipped slightly, her jaw tightened. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly when David mentioned Jennifer. When the recording finished, She was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me I'd just handed her evidence of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. And if the information about the first wife was accurate, possibly evidence of a previous homicide that had been missed. Within minutes, that conference room filled with people. Another agent, a technical specialist to verify my recording's authenticity, a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office who happened to be in the building. Everyone listened to the recording. Everyone's face showed the same grim recognition of how serious this was. Agent Chun asked me detailed questions about David, about Nina, about Dr. Marcus. She wanted to know about our finances, about the timeline of events, about anything that might corroborate what I'd recorded. I told her about the drained bank accounts, the shell company, the credit card charges showing the affair. I'd brought copies of everything I'd found, bank statements, all of it. The prosecutor, a thin man named Robert Vance, was particularly interested in Dr. Marcus. He explained that if Marcus was being coerced through blackmail, he might be willing to cooperate in exchange for immunity or a reduced charge. A cooperating witness with insider knowledge would be invaluable. But first, they needed to verify my story about Jennifer. Agent Chun made a call. Within 30 minutes, she had preliminary information. Jennifer Hartley, that was David's first wife's maiden name, had died 8 years ago in Portland. The death had been ruled a suicide by drug overdose. She was only 26 years old. The case file noted that she'd taken a massive dose of sleeping pills and cardiac medication, but there had been no suicide note. No history of mental illness. The investigation had been cursory, largely because her husband Dr. Davy Jadanovan was a respected surgeon who'd seemed genuinely devastated. There had been one anomaly in the file that the original investigators had apparently overlooked or dismissed. 3 months before her death, David had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Jennifer. Agent Chun looked at me across the table, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been anger. They'd missed it. 8 years ago, the system had failed Jennifer Hartley, and a murderer had walked free to kill again. Not this Chimmy. The team worked quickly, formulating a plan. They couldn't arrest David and Nina, yet the recording alone might not be enough to convict. And they needed to catch them in the act with the poison, with the full conspiracy exposed. They decided to set up a controlled operation. Here's what would happen. I would go home that evening, acting completely normal. I would not take the vitamins Dr. Marcus had prescribed, obviously. Instead, FBI agents would be positioned around my house, monitoring everything. David and Nina would expect me to die within 3 days. When I didn't, when I remained perfectly healthy, they would likely panic and reveal more of their plan or make a mistake. But Agent Chun also suggested something else, something that made my stomach turn but that I immediately recognized as necessary. They needed to bring Dr. Marcus in tonight. If Marcus could be convinced to cooperate, to testify about the blackmail and the poison, the case against David would be airtight. They could offer him immunity for his testimony. His cooperation would also potentially save his career and keep him out of prison. I thought about the terrified look on Dr. Marcus's face that afternoon, the way his hands had shaken as he'd slipped me that warning. He'd risked everything to try to save my life. He deserved a chance at redemption. I told Agent Chun to bring him in. While other agents went to locate and pick up Dr. Marcus, Agent Chun and I discussed the larger investigation. She wanted to look into David's gambling debts to $890,000 he'd mentioned in the recording. Where had that money gone? Who did he owe? That kind of debt didn't accumulate overnight. It suggested a pattern of behavior, of secrets David had been keeping for possibly years. She also wanted to examine the Clearwater Holdings shell company. Where had that $150,000 really gone? Was it hidden assets for his planned new life with Nina, or was there something else going on? The technical team verified my recording's authenticity, no editing, no manipulation. Metadata confirmed the time and date. It was genuine, and it was damning. 3 hours after I'd walked into that federal building, Dr. Marcus was brought into an interrogation room down the hall. Agent Chun asked if I wanted to watch through the one-way glass. I did. Marcus looked destroyed. His face was gray, his shoulders slumped. He knew why he was there, Agent Chun was direct with him. She told him they had evidence that he'd been coerced into participating in a murder conspiracy, that they understood he was a victim of blackmail, and that they were offering him a way out, full immunity, in exchange for complete cooperation and testimony. For several long minutes, Marcus said nothing. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Then, finally, he broke. He told them everything. 7 years ago, Marcus had made a catastrophic error during a routine surgery. He'd prescribed a medication without checking the patient's allergy records. The patient had gone into anaphylactic shock and nearly died. She survived, but she'd suffered permanent organ damage. Marcus had falsified records to cover up his mistake, terrified of losing his license and facing a malpractice lawsuit. David had discovered the falsified records 2 years ago. Marcus never knew how maybe David had been reviewing cases for some hospital committee. Maybe he'd simply stumbled across a discrepancy. But David had copies of everything, proof that Marcus had committed medical fraud and endangered a patient's life. David had leveraged that information ruthlessly. At first, he'd just asked for small favors, assessing patient records David shouldn't have access to. Writing prescriptions for medications David wanted. Marcus had complied, terrified of exposure. Then, 6 weeks ago, David had come to him with a much bigger request. He needed Marcus to help him kill his wife. Marcus had refused at first, horrified. But David had been clear: cooperate, or the evidence of Marcus's malpractice would go to the medical board, to the police, to the patient's family. Marcus would lose everything: his license, his livelihood, probably his freedom. So Marcus had agreed. David had given him the exact prescription to write iron supplements, or what I would believe were iron supplements. The pills in that vial were actually a carefully calibrated mixture of digitalis and potassium chloride that would cause cardiac arrest within 72 hours of the first dose. But Marcus couldn't live with it. He'd barely slept for weeks, consumed by guilt. When I'd come in for my appointment that afternoon, he'd made a split-second decision to warn me, even though it meant exposing himself. As I listened to Marcus's confession through the glass, I felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for him. Yes, he'd been weak. Yes, he'd made terrible choices. But he'd also tried to save me when it mattered most. Agent Chun asked Marcus if he would testify, if he would help them bring down David and Nina. Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face. He would do whatever they needed. The prosecutor drew up immunity paperwork on the spot. Marcus signed it with shaking hands. By 9 o'clock that night, the FBI had everything they needed to move forward. They had my recording. They had Marcus's testimony. They had evidence of the poison, of the blackmail, of the conspiracy. Now they just needed to catch David and Nina in the act. Agent Chun drove me home herself, explaining the operational details. Agents would be positioned in unmarked vehicles on my street. 2 agents would be in the house across from mine. The Hendersons were on vacation. Conveniently, surveillance equipment would monitor all entrances to my house. If David or Nina showed up unexpectedly, if anything happened that put me in danger, agents would intervene within seconds. I was also given a panic button, a small device that looked like a car key fob. One press, and agents would storm the house immediately. As we pulled up to my house, Agent Chun put a hand on my arm. She told me I was incredibly brave, that what I was doing would not only save my own life, but also get justice for Jennifer Hartley. She promised me that David would face consequences for everything he'd done. I walked into my house alone, locking the door behind me. The living room where I'd hidden in the closet that afternoon looked exactly the same. The couch where David and Nina had sat planning my murder was still perfectly arranged. Throw pillows in place, but everything had changed. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a woman with evidence, with federal agents protecting me, with a plan. David thought I would take those poisoned vitamins and die within 3 days. Instead, I was going to watch him destroy himself, one panicked mistake at a time. David came home at 8:30 that night, exactly as expected. I was in the kitchen, pretending to make tea, my heart racing despite the panic button in my pocket and the FBI agents watching from across the street. When he walked in, I saw him differently now, not as my husband of 20 years, but as a predator who'd been circling me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He kissed my forehead. asked about my day. His performance was flawless. I told him about my doctor's appointment, keeping my voice casual. Mentioned that Dr. Marcus had found me slightly anemic and prescribed iron supplements. David's eyes flickered with something satisfaction, maybe anticipation, but his face remained concerned and caring. He told me I should definitely take them, that anemia was serious, that I needed to take care of myself. I promised I would start taking them tomorrow morning. That night, lying next to him in bed, I wondered how many nights Jennifer had spent like this, sleeping beside a man who was secretly planning her death, trusting someone who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle and a payday. The next morning, I made a show of taking the first pill at breakfast. I palmed it instead, hiding it in my napkin while David watched from across the table. He seemed pleased, relaxed. Everything was going according to his plan. Or so he thought. Over the next 48 hours, I continued the charade, took my fake vitamins every morning, went to work, came home, acted completely normal while FBI agents monitored everything and built their case. Meanwhile, Agent Chun and her team were working in the background, unraveling the full scope of David's deception. What they discovered was staggering. The gambling debts were real. $190,000 owed to underground gambling operations in Portland and Seattle. David had been betting on everything from football to poker, chasing losses for years. He'd managed to hide it by slowly draining our accounts and taking cash advances on credit cards I didn't know existed. The Clearwater Holdings shell company was where David had hidden $150,000 of our money, transferring it bit by bit over the past year. He'd planned to use it as his escape fund with Nina once I was dead, and he'd collected the insurance money. But the most damning discovery came from Jennifer's case. Investigators reopened the file and interviewed witnesses who'd never been properly questioned 8 years ago. Jennifer's college roommate remembered her being excited about the future, talking about going back to school, showing no signs of depression. A neighbor recalled seeing David and Jennifer arguing violently 2 weeks before her death. David had never mentioned to police. Most significantly, they exhumed Jennifer's body. The autopsy revealed levels of digitalis and potassium chloride consistent with murder, not suicide. The same combination David was planning to use on me. He'd literally tried to use the same playbook twice. By the third day, the day I was supposed to die, could see David getting anxious. He watched me constantly, studying my face for signs of distress. He asked repeatedly how I was feeling. If I had any chest pain, any dizziness, any unusual symptoms, I told him I felt fine. Better, actually. The iron supplements seemed to be helping. His concern shifted to something else. Confusion. Worry. That evening, I overheard him on the phone in his study. His voice was tight, stressed. He was talking to Nina, demanding to know why the medication wasn't working, insisting that Marcus had assured him the dosage was correct. They were panicking. Agent Chun called me that night on a secure line. She said the investigation was complete, they had everything they needed. Financial records showing David's debts and the drained accounts. Marcus's testimony about the poison and the blackmail. The exhumation results from Jennifer's body, my recording of their conspiracy. It was time to bring them in. Tomorrow night, David and Nina would both be working late shifts at the hospital. They'd planned to meet at our house one final strategy session to figure out why I hadn't died yet, to recalibrate their plan. The FBI would be waiting. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of control. David thought he'd orchestrated the perfect murder. He'd planned every detail, eliminated every variable, accounted for every possibility, except one. He'd underestimated the woman he'd spent 20 years learning to manipulate. And that mistake was about to cost him everything. The next evening, I left the house at 6 o'clock, just as Agent Chun instructed. I drove to my sister Lauren's house in Seattle, a 2-hour drive that gave me an alibi and kept me safely away from what was about to happen. Lauren had finally been briefed by the FBI that morning. Her shock and rage when she learned the truth had been explosive. Now she sat with me in her living room, both of us staring at Agent Chun's number on my phone, waiting for the call. Back in Portland, David's car pulled into our driveway at 7:15. FBI surveillance captured everything. He used his key, entered through the front door, and immediately started pacing. His phone rang constantly. Nina, calling to say she was on her way. She arrived 20 minutes later. The moment Nina walked into that living room, agents positioned around the house confirmed both targets were inside. They waited, listening through concealed microphones, giving David and Nina enough time to incriminate themselves further. And they did. David's voice came through clearly, frustrated and confused. He demanded to know what had gone wrong, why I was still walking around perfectly healthy after 3 days. Nina suggested that maybe I hadn't been taking the pills. David insisted he'd watched me take them every morning. Then Nina said something that sealed their fate. She suggested they needed to accelerate the timeline, that maybe they should stage a more direct accident to fall down the stairs. Carbon monoxide poisoning, something that wouldn't rely on me cooperating by taking medication. David agreed. They discussed making it look like I'd fallen in the shower, hit my head. Quick, clean, no waiting. That's when Agent Chun gave the signal. FBI agents stormed the house from 3 entry points simultaneously: front door, back door, garage. David and Nina barely had time to react before they were surrounded by armed federal agents, ordered to their knees, hands behind their heads. Agent Chun told me later that David's face had gone completely white. Nina had tried to run toward the kitchen but was stopped immediately. Within 90 seconds, both were in handcuffs, their rights being read, the house being secured as a crime scene. Agents found the vial of poison in David's briefcase, same mixture of digitalis and potassium chloride that had killed Jennifer 8 years ago. They found documents outlining the insurance policies, the shell company accounts, the detailed timeline for disposing of my body and collecting the payout. They also found something I hadn't known about: a burner phone with text messages between David and Nina discussing not just my murder, but explicit details about how they'd killed Jennifer. They'd kept evidence of their previous crime, probably as some twisted insurance policy, against each other. That evidence was now in federal custody. My phone rang at 9th. Agent Chun's voice was calm but satisfied. She told me it was over, that both suspects were in custody, that I could come home whenever I was ready. I sat in Lauren's living room for another hour, shaking, crying, processing everything. 20 years of marriage had ended with my husband being arrested for trying to murder me. The man I'd trusted with everything had seen me as nothing more than a financial transaction. But he'd failed. And Jennifer Hartley would finally have justice. The next morning, news of David's arrest spread through Portland like wildfire. Prominent surgeon arrested for murder conspiracy. His mistress, also a physician, charged as an accomplice. The medical community was in shock. The evidence was overwhelming. My recording played in court during the preliminary hearing. David's voice calmly describing how the poison would stop my heart. Nina laughing about my jewelry. The courtroom went silent. Marcus testified, explaining the blackmail, the coercion, the exact composition of the poison David had ordered him to prescribe. The vial was entered as evidence, analyzed, confirmed to be lethal. Jennifer's family sat in the gallery, hearing for the first time the truth about how their daughter had died. Her mother wept when prosecutors presented the exhumation results, the proof that Jennifer had been murdered. David's defense tried to claim the recording was taken out of context, that he'd been joking, that it was all a misunderstanding. The jury didn't buy it. Nina's defense tried to paint her as a victim of David's manipulation, but her text messages revealed she'd been an eager, active participant in both murder plots. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The verdict took 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. David received life in prison without possibility of parole for 2 counts of first-degree murder. Nina got 25 years as an accomplice. Both lost their medical licenses permanently, their reputations destroyed, their futures erased. And I finally understood what Dr. Marcus's note had really meant. Don't go home that night not to hide, but to survive long enough to fight back. 3 years have passed since that night. 3 years since FBI agents stormed my living room and arrested the man I'd spent 20 years building a life with. 3 years since I learned that the person sleeping beside me every night had been planning my murder with the same cold calculation he used to plan our vacations. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, remembering David's voice through those closet slats, describing exactly how my heart would stop. But those moments are becoming less frequent. The nightmares are fading. What remains is something I never expected: peace. The legal aftermath took over a year to fully resolve. I sued David's estate civilly and was awarded every single asset: $2 million in combined holdings, including the house, his retirement accounts, and the money he'd hidden in that shell company. The court also ordered the seizure of all funds connected to his gambling debts, which meant his creditors got nothing. More importantly, Jennifer Hartley's family finally got justice. Her death was officially reclassified as homicide. Her name was cleared. The narrative that she'd been an unstable young woman who'd taken her own life was erased and replaced with the truth. She was murdered by a man she trusted. I met Jennifer's mother, Patricia, during the trial. We sat together in that courtroom, two women connected by the same predator, both of us reclaiming our stories. Patricia told me that for 8 years, she'd blamed herself for missing signs of her daughter's supposed depression. The relief on her face when she learned the truth, that Jennifer hadn't chosen to leave, that she'd been taken, was devastating and beautiful at once. We stayed in touch after the trial. Patricia and I created something meaningful from our shared trauma. The Jennifer Hartley Foundation launched 80 months ago. We used the money from David's estate to help families of domestic violence victims navigate the legal system, to fund investigations into suspicious deaths that were too quickly labeled as suicides or accidents, and to train medical professionals to recognize when colleagues might be using their expertise for harm. It's not just about the money. It's about making sure that what happened to Jennifer and almost happened to me doesn't happen to someone else. It's about teaching people that danger doesn't always look like a stranger in a dark alley. Sometimes it looks like a respected surgeon with a charming smile and 20 years of practice lying to your face. I still live in the house, though you wouldn't recognize it now. I spent 6 months renovating, tearing out every reminder of David. New paint, new furniture, new layout. The living room where he planned my murder is now my home office. Walls lined with bookshelves, filled with light. The bedroom we shared has been completely reconfigured. The closet where I hid and recorded his confession is now a small reading nook. I reclaimed every inch of this space and made it mine. My career survived, surprisingly. My company was incredibly supportive throughout the trial, and I've actually been promoted twice since then. Turns out, surviving a murder conspiracy makes you remarkably good at handling workplace stress. Everything else feels manageable by comparison. Lauren visits often. We're closer now than we've ever been. She jokes that she always knew David was too perfect, that something about him never quite added up. I wish I'd trusted her instincts years ago. Dr. Marcus completed his probation and had his medical license reinstated last year with conditions. He works in a free clinic now, treating underserved populations, trying to balance the scales after what he almost participated in. He sends me a card every year on the anniversary of the day he slipped me that warning. He never writes much as thank you for giving me a chance to do the right thing. I forgave him. Not immediately, but eventually. He was a victim too, trapped by his own mistakes and exploited by someone more ruthless. And when it mattered most, when he had to choose between protecting himself and saving my life, he chose me. People ask me sometimes how I moved on, how I learned to trust again after something like this. The truth is, I don't know if I'll ever trust the same way I did before. I was naive then, believing that love and history were enough to guarantee safety. Now I know better, but I also learned something David never understood. I'm stronger than he ever gave me credit for. He spent 20 years studying my weaknesses, learning how to manipulate me, assuming I'd be an easy target. He was Hong, and because he underestimated me, because he thought I'd quietly take those pills and die without question, Jennifer's real killer is in prison, and I'm here telling this story. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, drop a comment and tell me what city you're from. I love knowing this story is reaching people everywhere, maybe helping someone recognize danger in their own life before it's too late. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel something, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories here, stories of survival, of justice, of people who refuse to be victims. Thank you for listening to mine.